Welcome to Charlie Crimebuster. This podcast contains adult subject matter. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
The Minneapolis school shooting. We're going to talk about that on today's Charlie Crime Talk as you join James Buckland and I as we discuss this tragic incident that took place just a week ago. So welcome to the Charlie Crime Talk. James, how you doing, my friend?
Doing well. Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, everything is going well. It's just, this is a very tough topic to have to discuss.
Yes, it is. It's a tough one, but I think it's one that we do need to talk about, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I think in the podcast, I basically said it is a sobering yet essential podcast to do.
I agree. Yeah, I certainly do agree. So why did you cover this, since it was not usually the type of podcast that we normally do?
Well, that's a really good question, because, you know, as of late, we've been doing a whole lot of true crime stuff, talking about people and crimes and this type of thing, and trials and all sorts of things like that, with the Epstein that we've just been talking about, and then the Karen Reed one, and all the others that we've been covering. This is a little different, but, you know, I think we sometimes have to remember and go back to our roots when we first started Charlie Crimebuster podcast, where we're talking about times when we wanted to help alert the public and try to keep the public safe and to share safety tips to do that. And I think that it would be very disfavorable if we did not take the time to point out these shootings, that there are things that we can do, not only to save our own lives, but maybe to save the lives of others. And so we share this with the simple, really purpose of trying to get the public to realize that the very best defense we have against these crazy mass shooters today is the American public. And us being alerted to those around us, and looking for signs. And when we see somebody headed that way, that we see something, we say something. You know, there have been a number of shootings in this country that has been stopped because alert people have seen something and said something. Now, we don't hear about those every day, but there's really countless ones. I mean, I read about them very often. You know, we've had them here in Daytona, where I'm from, and I'm sure where a lot of folks are from. You know, there's been a lot of arrests with, people who've been planning these kind of shootings. So I think we just have to continue to be alert. We have to continue to be diligent. I think this one certainly, caught the attention of our country because it was such a horrific, evil act of violence.
Tell us about where this happened, Charlie.
Well, this happened in Minneapolis. This was a Catholic school, a Catholic church that has a private school. It's called the Annunciation, of course, referring to Gabriel, the archangel, when he made the announcement to Mary that she would be of birth of the Christ child. And so here is a really religious school that, these children are coming there to get a good Christian education. The website says they teach Christian values and citizenship. And, you know, here these students are at a place where you would think they would be safe. They felt safe. Their parents felt they were safe. And yet this madman walks up with a rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol and fires through the window, killing two of the children and wounding 17 other people. A terrible day for this entire school facility and the parents that were all related to it.
But what did you mean when you said that it was a tragedy with hope?
Well, you know, I think that this happens so often, James, in all these situations. You know, in shootings, we hear over and over again about the heroic acts of others. We see how the community bands together. They determine that one terrible tragedy isn't going to mark them for the rest of their lives. And in this situation, we hear all kinds of stories. One of the stories that we told in the podcast was about a little boy there who was like 10 years of age, and he said that while he was there and they were shooting, that one of the older teenagers there, the young teenagers, I guess up to junior high, I think it went, that one of the older students actually covered him up with his own body, and by doing that, took a bullet to the back. Now, thankful that that young man that covered the body of this little one, he's going to be okay. And the little boy said, "Well, I'm praying for him." And so, that's pretty heroic for a adolescent, a young teenager to cover their bodies, cover the body of a smaller child to protect them, because this guy was just firing at will into this church. James, there was 110 spent rifle jackets that was found there. So we know he fired in there over 100 times. He fired a shotgun. I think there were three shotgun shells found. There was a pistol that was found and a live round where he had misfired. So we know that there was over 110, maybe 120 rounds was fired into this church. And yet, during the time, the older students covered the younger students. The faculty, without any thought of their own safety, was running down through there and making sure they were barring the doors to keep him from coming in. And on top of that, they were yelling, "Get down, get down, get down." And all these faculty members, adults, were not concerned about their own safety. They were concerned about the safety of those children. So in the midst of all this tragedy, I think there is the hope that we see that there are still good people in this world. This was an evil monster that did this. And yet in the midst of evil, there are these heroes that come to the light. So that's what I mean when I say in the midst of tragedy, there was hope. There was sorrow, but yet there was hope. There was these people who are going to stay together, and they're not going to let this tragedy define them and go forward.
Wow. Well, tell us again about the timeline or the steps of the mass shooter.
Well, we try to, every time we cover anything like a mass shooting, we always try to educate those who are listening with us. In studying mass shootings, you can see that there are what I call steps to their evil. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things you see is that there's always what is called the planning stage. When someone gets this idea they're going to do this, and oftentimes when they do this, they will write things down. They may have a journal, they may have a diagram. They take the time to plan what they're doing. They don't usually just jump up in the morning and grab a gun and go to a place and start shooting. They've already thought this out, and it was certainly true in this situation. The second step is what we call not only the planning, but there is what we call the procurement. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to do a shooting, you've got to procure your weapons, and so if you're seeing somebody and all of a sudden they're not around guns a lot, and then suddenly they have guns, or you see them getting guns, you see them going and picking up ammo, and don't generally do that. Yep. And you see them doing all these things. They're procuring the things to do it. The third step that we usually find is what we call the practice. And most of the time, these people, before they will go to do their shooting, they'll usually go to a firing range somewhere and they'll practice. About a couple of years ago, we covered the story in Daytona Beach where there was a young college student at Embry-Riddle, I believe. And he was made up his mind that he was going to do a shooting. And he had somehow, I guess he communicated that. Somebody overheard him or saw him or something other. So they saw something, they said something. The police moved in, and James, listen, they stopped him while he was on the way to the firing range to practice that morning, and that afternoon he had planned to do the shooting. Wow! So there's oftentimes that practice time that you'll see. The next time was what I call the penetration. You've got to once you're going to do the shooting, there should be lines of defense. In schools there are, but you have to somehow break down that line of defense. Now, in this shooting was very interesting because, he did not go into the school. He just walked up to that church and shot through the window, but he did penetrate. He penetrated, the area of the church. He penetrated the school and he did that. So the idea is that if you see somebody walking through these stages, if we can get them before they do the deed, then we can save lives. And that's why we always try to tell people to remember these steps, the planning, the the procurement, the practice, the penetration. If you can stop them along the way there, then there's a possibility you can stop a mass shooting.
So how did that relate to the student, though, Charlie?
Well, you certainly, it's been revealed in this particular one. He certainly did a lot of planning. And the way we know he did that planning is because he had even planned that after this event took place, he had scheduled a couple of videos on YouTube. And in those videos, he was giving all kinds of messages. You might say that he kind of had his own way of trying to communicate to people what was going on, his own manifesto, you might say. There was also online messages from him that was released that was timed to publish during the shooting. Now the FBI ordered those YouTube clips to be taken down, and they began to review them, but they were up there for a while. And that video included a handwritten map of the interior of that Annunciation Church. Even his firearms, there were pictures of his firearms in the magazines. There was all sorts of political slogans in silver marker, both in English and Russian, which is pretty interesting. And one of them said, "Kill Trump," and one said, "Kill the children," and this sort of thing. So he says in these writings, he talks about his plans of doing a shooting. Another thing we found is that he had a real, I guess he was focused in on the Sandy Hook shooting. And the shooter of the Sandy Hook was his hero. And he said he wanted to be a hero like that, and he said he wanted to kill children. And here's the thing that I think is so chilling about this whole situation with this guy. He, in his planning, he was writing and he said, "I want to kill the most children I possibly can." He said, "I don't want to kill adults." So, there was a reference there. "I don't want to do it when they're dropping them off because there's too many adults around there. But I'd like to get them when the most children are present." And he said, maybe when they're coming in from the playground, from recess, or when maybe they're a group set together. Of course, we think sometimes of the school cafeteria. But in this situation, he knew, because he was a student there, he graduated from grammar school there, he knew they had these mass assemblies. And his plan that he could kill more children because they're all there together mass to do that. And so, I mean, when I think about that, it really just disturbs me so much that this guy is not only planning to do a mass shooting, he's planning to kill as many children as he possibly can. And that's just as dark as you can get,
It is dark. It's very dark. Is there anything else that the school could have done to prevent this tragedy?
Well, the school had, the best I can tell, they had a lot of drills, both before this year and that year, of course. But most of those drills, James was talking about being in the classroom, and we do security in a lot of private schools. My company does, and in that, we have drills with the teachers, and we talk about how you bar up the classroom, you put all kinds of stuff before it, you get the children away from the doors and the windows and that sort of thing. So they had a lot of those drills, but I don't really think they really thought that it would ever happen, of all times in mass.
Right.
But even though they did not have drills, maybe when they did the assembly, the training, and this is why it's so important for schools to do this, the training still kicked in. They knew that they had to do the best they can to get those kids, those children under cover. And so, they would get them to get under the pew, and get away from the window and everything. So it did really break in. They ran to try to secure the door. They kept telling the kids to get down, to get down, to get down, to get down, So because they had practice, I think that helped a great deal. And, I started to call this thing the miracle, the miracle of Minneapolis. And you say, well, why is there a miracle? Think about this. Over 100 rounds, and one being killed is too many, but just think, only two kids killed out of the hundreds that were there. So It is really a miracle that more were not killed and more people did not die. But there were so many good things going on. Not only the fact that these adults came to be the heroes, and these older students came to be the heroes, But even the police officers, when they got there, they already knew that their job at that point, the guy had killed himself. So they knew there wasn't any, there wasn't a mass shooter anymore. The subject killed himself. So immediately they gave attention to the wounds, and they began to put pressure on the wounds and use all kinds of gas, these first aid kits they had with them. And they did to stop the bleeding. But the quicker you stop the bleeding, the more you can save lives. And seconds and minutes count. And so these police officers who got there before the emergency people did, the EMTs did, they had been trained, and every department should be trained like this. Every department that immediately go in there and do the first aid, stop the bleeding, put the tourniquets on, stop the bleeding. They did that. They helped transfer them to the ambulances. When the wounded children and adults got to the hospital, it was a trauma center. They had already trained for that. They've already had gunshot victims, and they had already had another mass shooting. And so immediately the doctors went to work, So I guess I would have to say, if you wanted to critique this particular shooting, boy, you hope it never, ever happened. But these folks really, I thought, really did move to the training from the faculty that was there, to the police officers that responded, to the medical people that came and rendered aid, to the doctors and the nurses and all of those who immediately, gave care to these people. So yes, I don't know that there's anything else they could do. The only other thing that I don't know, I have not read that there were any security officers there at all. In the public schools, we have resource officers. In a lot of the private schools that we partner with, we provide armed security. And, if this were to happen in one of our schools, when I put a armed security officer in a school setting, the first thing that I want to know before I do anything else is that if the unthinkable happens, I want to know that officer, that he or she immediately knows their duty is to confront the shooter. That's the first thing you do. You confront the shooter.
Right.
The quicker we can take the shooter down, the more lives we can save. And so I do not read that they had any security, hired private security there. And if there's one thing that I think they could do to improve, every private school ought to have armed security on the premise, in my opinion.
Right. That's important. What stood out to you about this particular shooter?
Well, I think it's just how evil,
yeah, he's evil.
I want to kill kids. I want to see the bullets tear them apart. And as we warned the people on the podcast, it was really, 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 really dark podcast to think about, wanting to see these bullets tear through these kids and tear them apart. That's the kind of thing he talked about. That's what he wanted to see. He talked about he wanted to be dressed up when he did his shooting, and he wanted to kill as many kids as he possibly could. Who does that? This is a very sick person, of course we do know, that he was first a he, and then I think in 2017, he wanted to become a female, and but then 5 years later he wasn't sure. One of his writings, he said, I like to dress up and feel girly, but I don't really feel like I'm a woman, but I don't feel like I'm a man. Well, I tell you, he wasn't a very good woman or man, as far as I'm concerned. He was a coward. Nobody but a coward would go shoot children,
Yep. I agree with you there. No doubt about that. Well, tell us about the so-called second attack that you mentioned in the podcast.
Well, I think there was a second attack. I don't know whether people really picked up on it or not, but there was a lot of, and here's the thing. When we have these shootings, people try to, a lot of times they want to bring politics in. They want to talk about gun control and that sort of thing. And that's always crazy when people rush to that. That's not a time to even talk about those things. But the thing that really got me on this last one was even, the governor of California and a few other people in prominent spots they talked about, hey, prayer doesn't work anymore. Don't just say you're praying for these people. We need to do something for them. And they really were defaming these people who are praying. Even the children themselves were praying, and so there was, in my opinion, there was not only a physical attack upon this Christian institution, but there was also a spiritual attack
Mm-hmm.
because they were attacking the people of faith, trying to say that prayer doesn't work, that
Right.
prayer is not what we should do. But people who do that, and I said this in the podcast, I feel sorry for people who say that because they don't realize what prayer is. Prayer is not, and I think I said this in the podcast, it's not a get out of jail free card in the monologue of life. Prayer doesn't mean that we don't have problems. Prayer doesn't mean that we won't face adversity.
Right.
Prayer just means that we have God with us to go through that adversity, that we have God with us to go through that suffering time, and that comfort of God, which we pray for, is very real. You can talk to the parents there in this incident, and you can talk to hundreds and hundreds of people who tell you how prayer fortifies them in their worst days.
Right.
And so I do think that there was an attack upon the faith of these people, and as a result of that, upon the faith of all of us who believe in God and believe in prayer and practice prayer.
Right.
So I just said to the folks on the podcast, you just keep on praying. That's the best thing that you can possibly do. Even the vice president, who is a Catholic himself, he commented on it, and talked about how, prayer, when we say we're praying, that doesn't mean we're not doing anything else. Prayer helps us to look at the problems. Prayer helps us and gives us the fortitude to follow through on solutions.
Right. Right.
It gives us strength, Yeah.
Right. And it allows us to cope with whatever situation is in front of us.
Exactly. I mentioned in the podcast, when I was a teenager, I remember, there was a man in the area there. One of my friends, actually, his brother, who was 16 years of age, I was friends with his older brother, and he was killed in an automobile accident. And I saw their parents go through all this grief, and I just couldn't imagine, how can you do that? How could you even go on living if your son was killed? And he told me, he said to me, he said, the same faith that I have when things are going good, that same faith also helps me to go through the tough times. God
Right.
gives me grace in order to withstand that thing. It doesn't mean that he doesn't grieve. It doesn't mean that there's not sorrow. It doesn't mean that it's not probably the hardest thing he ever faced in his life. It just means he doesn't have to face it by himself.
Right.
He has faith. He has someone that his faith comforts him and helps him in it. Another man who was really well known in our community, a civic leader in our community, and everybody looked up to his family, and they were a faith church-going family, and yet his daughter was killed in an accident. And somebody said, how could that happen? You're such a great person of faith. And he said, I don't ask myself that. I don't ask why it happened to me. I ask why not should it happen to me? Because I'm just like anybody else, and even,
Right.
The Bible says rains on the just and the unjust,
Right.
Yeah, God never promises the people of faith that they'll not have obstacles and heartache and sorrow. This part of life. But
That's
it's
right.
that faith that gives us the strength to go through life. And I thought that this was just a good time for us to mention this because I think it was a cheap shot from the bleachers for people to ridicule people's prayer during a time like this.
I agree. So what's on the agenda for this coming weekend?
Well, I'm really not quite sure yet. We kind of watch and see what the news brings our way. There's still some more things happening on the Jeffrey Epstein case. Even this week there's things that are happening there. One thing I don't know that we'll get to it this week, but there is one that's coming up that I want us to do that I've got a whole lot of interest in. And, maybe some of our younger listeners may not be able to identify with it. But a few years ago in the state of Tennessee, there was a sheriff by the name of Buford Pulser, and he was called Walking Tall. The
Mm-hmm.
Dwayne the Rock actually in a new movie talked about Walking Tall.
Right.
Well, James Purser was the sheriff that did that. His wife was killed. According to him, they were on their way to a call that morning, and he was ambushed because he was cleaning up the Dixie Mafia, and she was killed there. He died not too long after that in a car crash. And the Tennessee, the TBI just announced last week, and the district attorney said that they've reopened that case where his wife died, in that hell of bullets, as he said he was ambushed. That they now believe that they have probable cause that if Ulcer was still alive, that they would probably indict him for the murder of his wife.
Really?
Yes. So
Wow.
that is really that news really got my attention. Now I
Wow.
was from Tennessee, not that part of Tennessee. I was from East Tennessee, and I had met Buford Pulser. He'd come to our school when I was a teenager and did an assembly. And I remember, we all looked up to him. There's a lot of people, including myself, who got into law enforcement probably because of that movie and, wanting to fight against evil and that sort of thing. So a lot of people even got into law enforcement as a result of him. But now we're being told that, that it was a farce, that they even went and exhumed her body, and they're saying that the wounds do not match what Pulser said happened on that ambush, and that she was actually shot outside the car and not inside the car. So
Wow.
I think it would be a very interesting case for us to take on and look and go back and see, what really happened there. I
Sure.
do know that living in the state, I had been told by people who lived in the area that it wasn't all, that he wasn't all what he was cracked up to be, and that there was people who have always doubted, some of the things that were taking place with him. So we may, talk about the, and I'd love to hear some of the folks that are listening. If you'd like for us to take this on as a case, I think it would be quite fascinating to see something that was so much a part of our culture. This hero walking tall, and to say, well, maybe he didn't walk so tall as well. Maybe he walked a lot shorter than we thought.
Well, do you think that it might have been a friendly fire, possibly? He was trying to aim at somebody and
Well, no. According to that there was some domestic violence involved in this,
hmm.
and there were some other things that have come to the surface now. So either it is people trying to tear him down and they don't have any evidence, or they do have evidence, and that's what I think why would make the podcast so interesting. Yeah,
Right.
is there something there, or is there not?
That's
Now there
good.
are some people who said, hey, it's happened so long ago, you just need to let it go. There's no use trying to drag something down.
Right.
But think about this: if it did happen, doesn't his wife deserve justice?
Oh,
You know,
agreed. Yes. Yes,
if it
absolutely.
did happen, doesn't her family deserve to know what really happened?
Right. Right.
So I'm thinking this might be our next case is walking tall. I'd love to hear if anybody out there, if you'll reach out to us at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. If you know anything about the case, then reach out to us. If you'd like to see us discuss this case, reach out to us. I think it would be a fascinating case.
I do too. Well, thank you, Charlie. This was a great show, and we
Yeah,
look
and
forward to.
let me point out again before
Yeah.
somebody writes us and gets on the email.
Yep.
You're right. We did not do a crazy crook story because we just didn't feel that it was
Right.
that it was the right time to do it with something so sober as these children being murdered in this school setting. So we didn't forget it,
No, exactly.
but we just didn't think it was the right time to do it with this case. So let's just say that as an afterthought. And thank you, folks, for joining us tonight as we discuss this terrible, terrible shooting. And please, 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 if you see something out there, do something. And if you are having challenges mentally and you fantasize in your mind that you want to go out and shoot up a school, or you want to go do a mass shooting. Please, please, if you have those thoughts, call somebody, get some help. Get some help before innocent people are hurt or innocent people die. We're begging you to do that, folks. If you have those thoughts, please get some help. If you know somebody that they've given you some signs, and if you see something, please say something. I think we need to say that before we leave, James.
I agree. Thank you, Charlie.
So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep, for the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional information and podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Peacemaker Network, and also encourage you to support the first responders, military, and law enforcement personnel by contributing to the Peacemaker Network. That's peacemakernetwork.com. All music and sound effects are courtesy of Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com. You can also support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, tag @CharlieCrimebuster, and then click the subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be notified each time we drop one of our shows. Another more convenient way for you to listen to our podcasts, or for you to say to your smart speaker, play Charlie Crimebuster. If you have comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you, so please send them to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us again for another exciting crime episode with Charlie Crimebuster.